there are much bigger tides in American presidential elections that both explain how our elections work and enable us to do the kind of prediction by which I've been able to predict every election from 1984 to 2008, almost every time, long before the campaign even begins. I've issued my predictions, often long before we even know who's running for office, because my predictions are based on a different model, a different understanding of how presidential elections work. In fact, I issued my prediction for the last presidential election, the one that elected Barack Obama in 2008. My prediction came out in a published article in February 2006. That's right, 2006. More than 2.5 years before the election, I was able to say, no matter who the Democrats nominate, the Democratic Party is going to take over the White House from the Republican Party of the then president. Who was president before Barack Obama? Bush. The Democrats are going to take over from the Republican Party of George W. Bush, who could not run again, because in America, under a constitutional amendment, a president can only serve 2 4-year terms, then you're out. You can never run again for president. In fact, in 2006, I became notorious. I became infamous because I said the Democrats could pick a name out of the phone book and elect that person president of the United States in 2008. Now, how am I able to do this? I don't read tea leaves. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't study the intestines of birds to try to figure this out. Rather, I have a theory and a model. And the theory is that presidential elections are not decided by campaigns, but they are decided by government. And I think this is so important, especially for students, for young people, to say, look, in the conventional wisdom and everything you read in here, everything is the campaign. No! What really counts is government. That what determines the results of American presidential elections primarily is how well the party in power has governed the country. If the party in power has governed well, then that party, remember it's always a Republican or a Democrat, will be returned to office for another 4 years. If that party in power has governed poorly, they're going to be turned out and the opposition party is going to win. In 2008, when Barack Obama was running against the Republican John McCain, in the middle of the campaign, an ordinary guy became somewhat famous because he stepped up at a campaign rally and asked Barack Obama a lot of obnoxious questions. You want to be famous in America, be obnoxious. That's one way. And he was a plumber. He fixed bathrooms and pipes. And he became known as Joe the Plumber, right? Okay. Let's say you hired Joe the Plumber to fix the pipes in your house or your apartment. And Joe the Plumber broke your pipes and flooded your living room. Are you going to hire Joe the Plumber again? I don't think so. You would only hire Joe the Plumber again if he did a really good job of fixing your pipes. Same thing with the party holding the White House. You're not going to hire that party again if they broke the pipes of the country and flooded its living room. You're only going to hire them again if they did a good job. And as you'll see in a moment, the keys to the White House are a model that translates that driving idea of governing performance by the party in power that counts into a very specific model that anyone can use to predict and explain presidential elections. You all have a copy? All right, you don't need me again. You're all forecasters. Because this is the world's only do-it-yourself presidential prediction system. I never bet on my predictions because I'm very superstitious and don't want to jinx them, but everyone here is free to go ahead and become very rich betting on the American presidential elections. Now, I would love to tell you, particularly love to tell the students, that I came up with the keys to the White House by tens of thousands of hours of deep meditation, by years ruining my eyes in dusty archives and libraries. But if I were to tell you that, to quote the late American President Richard Nixon, that would be wrong. I came across the keys totally and completely by accident. But you know, a lot of good discoveries are made by accident. The key is to take advantage of the accidents. You know, to have the drive and the motivation. Drive, motivation, ability to think unconventionally, to go in new directions, I think it is so important if you're going to be a successful analyst. As you heard in the introduction, I was a visiting distinguished scholar at the California Institute of Technology in 1981. I was 9 years old at the time, but that's a whole other issue. And I met another visiting distinguished scholar whose name was Valeja Kailis Bora from Moscow. In those days, remember, that was the Soviet Union, not Russia. And he was the world's leading authority in earthquake prediction, and one of the world's most eminent, most famous, important geophysicists. He was the head of the World Geophysical Society. And we had a nice talk, and I said, "Nice to meet you, goodbye." And he said, "Wait." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "You and I are going to collaborate." And I said, "No, we're not." You know, earthquakes is a big thing in California, because they have that big fault in California. But I have to go back to Washington, D.C. It's politics. Nobody cares about earthquakes in Washington, D.C. And he said, no. We're not going to collaborate on earthquakes. We're going to collaborate on using the methods of earthquake prediction for something else. Get this. He said he was a member of the Soviet scientific delegation that came to Washington in 1963 and negotiated the first nuclear treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union, the first ever treaty. Anybody know what that was in 1963? It was the nuclear S-band treaty that was particularly important for stopping the Soviet Union from detonating those enormous bombs, 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he said, after coming to the United States, he fell in love with politics. And he said he always wanted to use the methods of earthquake prediction to predict elections. But he said, look, I live in the Soviet Union. You know, predicting elections? Forget it. It's supreme leader or off with your head, you know, the hell with predictions. But he said, but you're an expert in American politics, and we can use your knowledge and my methods to predict American presidential election results. At this point, I thought the guy was maybe nuts, or maybe part of the KGB, you know, the Soviet secret police, when there really was a KGB back in the days of the Soviet Union. But I'm an historian, I have nothing to hide. And then I began to think about it. Think about it, my friends. You can, in fact, reinterpret American elections, or any elections, including elections here in India, in geophysical terms. Think about it. Stability equals the party holding the White House stays in power. Upheaval, the party holding the White House is turned out of power. So instead of considering elections as liberals versus conservatives, or Republicans versus Democrats, or back then Jimmy Carter, the Democrat, versus Ronald Reagan, you rethink them in geophysical terms as stability and upheaval. Then you can use the methods of earthquake prediction. And what they do in earthquake prediction is they look at patterns in the physical environment associated with stability and upheaval. Of course, we couldn't do that, but we could look at patterns in the political environment associated with stability and upheaval. And we looked at a whole bunch of different factors, all based on my theory that elections are driven not by the campaign, but primarily by the strength and performance of the party holding the White House. And amazingly, we came up with a clear pattern. We came up with these 13 key factors that you have in your hands right now, which are simply big picture questions. They look at the society as a whole, things like the economy, foreign policy, social unrest, scandal, third party. And they're simple. That's what I said. Do it yourself. They're just true-false questions that can be answered often well ahead of time before a presidential election occurs. And to use the keys, you don't even have to take your shoes off. All you have to do is be able to count to 6. That is, if 6 or more of these 13 keys are false, the answer 6 or more questions false, the party holding the White House loses. Fewer than 6, the party holding the White House wins. So in American baseball terms, I'd like to put it in cricket terms, but Americans know nothing about cricket. 6 strikes and you're out, okay? Fewer than 6 strikes, you're in. And this pattern held from 1860 up to 1980. Remember, we did this in 1981. So we looked at 120 years of American politics. From the election of Abraham Lincoln back in the horse and buggy days of 1860, all the way to the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 in the days of polls and television and computers and jet planes. This was an incredible discovery to show that over this enormous period of change in American history, the same basic, pragmatic, practical decision rule held. Over 120 years, Americans were basically looking at governance, not at campaigning. Now, many of you in this room, fellow academics, like me, I know some of you are, so you know what academics do when they make a big discovery like this. They publish it in a scholarly journal where they expect at least 4 or 5 people to actually read it. Well, it turned out 6 people read our article. And the 6th person was the reporter for the Associated Press, the big wire service in the United States. And I'm back in Washington, D.C., sitting in my office in 1981, and I open the paper, and there is an article that has to be about the Soviet geophysicist and the American historian. The article read, "Odd couple discovers keys to the White House." Well, the odd couple had to be the 2 of us. And indeed it was. So suddenly I was in the paper. And, I'm a young scholar, and I'm thinking, do I really want to go pop with all this? Do I want to be on the paper, in the papers, and on television? Or do I want to, stay as kind of a strict scholar academician? And after 6 seconds of deep thought, I said, I'm going pop. And I published my first prediction on the keys in April of 1982. 2.5 years before the next presidential election of 1984, in which I predicted that President Ronald Reagan, the Republican, would be reelected. 2.5 years ahead of time prediction. And since that time, I have used the keys to the White House to forecast, often 2 to 3 years ahead of time, every American presidential election from 1984 to 2008. And from time to time, the politicians actually paid attention. After I published my 1982 article, I get a call in my office, and the gentleman says, "Professor Lichtman, this is Leah Orr calling. I'm the political director of the Ronald Reagan White House. We want you to come to the White House." And I said, Ronald Reagan, conservative Republican, I don't know.